Snow lashed against the 42nd floor windows of the Northfield Capital Partners tower on Bay Street, and Charlotte Renfrew held a checkbook pen above a stack of insolvency documents thick enough to stop a door. Her hand did not move. Somewhere behind her, radiators ticked, and somewhere below, Toronto blurred into a smear of red brake lights and white snowfall, indifferent to the fact that in about 4 minutes, a company her grandfather had built out of a two-desk brokerage on Adelaide Street was going to cease to exist. Renfrew. The voice belonged to Nolan Pierce, senior restructuring counsel from Whitcomb Draper LLP, a man who had billed more hours in the last 6 weeks than most lawyers billed in a year. The Ontario Superior Court filing window closes at 9. If this isn't submitted, the Monitor takes control of every account by lunch, and we lose whatever leverage remains to protect the pension funds. I understand what happens if I don't sign, Nolan. Charlotte's voice was steady in the practiced way of someone who had learned, very young, that steadiness was armor. What I don't understand is how $890 million belonging to the Halton District School Board, the Steelworkers Local Pension Trust, and 11,000 retired teachers simply evaporated in 4 months. Malcolm Ferris, Chief Financial Officer, stood at her shoulder with the particular gentleness men use when they want a woman to stop asking questions. He had been her father's CFO before he was hers. 26 years at Northfield. A man who had walked her through her first quarterly earnings call when she was 29 and terrified, who had stood beside her at her father's funeral, holding an umbrella over both their heads. Currency markets, Charlotte. Malcolm's tone was patient, almost paternal. The pound and the yen both moved against us at once. Our emerging markets hedges got caught in a perfect storm. I've explained this 3 times to the board and twice to the OSC. There is no fraud here. There is only very, very bad luck, and it is going to keep being bad luck if you don't sign before the market opens. She did not look at him. She looked at the pen. Nobody in that boardroom noticed the man in the gray Trident Facility Services uniform kneeling by the recycling bins in the far corner, quietly and invisibly failing to leave. Ellis Novak had learned, in the 5 years since his life fell apart, that the wealthy do not see cleaners. They see uniforms. A person in a gray polo shirt with a spray bottle on his hip is furniture that occasionally moves. And Ellis had become very good at being furniture, because furniture does not get fired for being in the wrong place. And Ellis needed this job the way a drowning man needs a rope. He had not always been furniture. 6 years ago, he'd worn a different kind of uniform, a charcoal suit and a Confederation Mutual lanyard, and he had spent his days modeling mortality tables and interest rate risk for one of the largest actuarial consultancies in the country. He liked numbers because numbers, unlike people, did not lie to make you feel better. A discount rate was a discount rate. A loss ratio told the truth whether or not you wanted to hear it. Then his wife, Grace, had a stroke in the parking lot of a Loblaws in Etobicoke on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday she was gone. And Ellis was a 39-year-old widower with a 4-year-old son and a mortgage that no longer made sense on one income. He held it together for 11 months. Then Milo, his son, was diagnosed with a congenital defect in the wall between the chambers of his heart, the kind that could be managed with medication for a while, but that would eventually and unforgivingly require open-heart surgery that the Ontario health system would cover. Mostly, except for the specialist cardiologist consults, the travel to sick kids for the pre-op imaging. The weeks Ellis couldn't work because someone had to sit in the waiting room. He missed too many days at Confederation Mutual. Nobody said the words, "We're letting you go," cruelly. They said them with a fruit basket and a severance check, and that was somehow worse. Now he cleaned glass. He liked the 4 to midnight shift because it meant he could get Milo to school in the morning and be home again by 1 a.m. And his sister, Deb, who lived 2 streets over in the Junction, watched the boy while he worked. Tonight, the shift had run long. The Northfield executive floor was a wreck of catered trays and legal pads because the entire senior team had been living in that boardroom for a week, and his supervisor, a man named Bricker, who Ellis privately thought had never done an honest hour of physical labor in his life, had threatened to dock his pay if the glass wasn't spotless before the 7 a.m. meeting. At 6:15, wiping down the great smart glass wall the executives used to project financial data during meetings, Ellis paused with his squeegee halfway down a column of numbers, because his actuarial brain, the one he had spent a decade training and could never fully switch off, had caught something the way you catch a wrong note in a song you know by heart. The screen still glowed with the previous night's presentation, FX hedging cost, Q3, emerging markets basket, line after line of trade executions attributed to a counterparty called Kestrel Bridge Capital. 41 million here, 63 million there, all booked as currency hedge losses against the Mexican peso and the Turkish lira. Ellis had priced currency derivatives for a living once. These losses were enormous, nearly $400 million across the quarter, and they were, on their face, plausible. Currency markets did move like that sometimes. Except. He pulled the crumpled notebook from his back pocket, the one where he tracked Milo's medication doses and cardiology appointments, flipped to a blank page, and started doing what his hands remembered doing before they learned to hold a squeegee instead of a pen. Trade date October the 12th. Trade date October the 12th, again. Trade date October the 12th, a third time, a fourth, a fifth, nearly $60 million in currency hedges, all supposedly executed on October the 12th. Ellis knew that date. Everyone in finance knew that date because on October the 12th, a catastrophic systems failure at the Toronto Stock Exchange's clearing infrastructure, the kind of outage that makes the evening news, had frozen electronic trading across the entire exchange for 6 hours. He remembered it specifically because Grace's cardiologist appointment for Milo's first echocardiogram had been that same afternoon, and he'd had the radio on in the hospital parking lot, listening to a business reporter describe traders standing around helplessly while the whole system sat dark. You could not execute $60 million in currency hedges through a halted exchange. You could not execute anything. Ellis's stomach dropped the way it used to when a model came back with a number that meant somebody, somewhere, was about to lose their pension. He kept scanning. The wire routing for the Kestrel Bridge trades didn't run through any of the clearing banks Northfield normally used. RBC Capital Markets, TD Securities, the usual names. It ran through a correspondent bank in Georgetown, Cayman Islands, and Kestrel Bridge Capital, according to the small print at the bottom of the ledger, had a registered address that was, Ellis was fairly sure, a mailbox rental shop. This wasn't bad luck with currency markets. This was someone inventing trades that never happened and shipping the money offshore. He looked at the clock. 6:40. He needed to leave before the executives arrived. If he was caught studying proprietary trading data, he would not just lose his job, he could be arrested, and Milo could not afford to have his father in a holding cell instead of at his bedside for the pre-op consult in 9 days. Ellis wiped the smudge his palm had left on the glass, shoved his notebook back in his pocket, and told himself, the way he told himself most mornings, that the troubles of billionaires were not his to solve. The oak doors opened before he could wheel his cart to the service exit. In walked Charlotte Renfrew, hollow-eyed and immaculate, flanked by Malcolm Ferris and a small army of lawyers, and Ellis had nowhere left to go but the corner alcove by the recycling bins, where he crouched and made himself as small and as gray as the uniform he wore. For 18 minutes he listened. He heard the CFO blame currency markets for a loss. Ellis now knew, with the cold certainty of arithmetic, could not have happened the way Malcolm Ferris said it happened. He heard the lawyer talk about court filing windows the way other people talk about weather. He heard Charlotte Renfrew's voice crack, just once, on the word how, and Ellis thought of the exact sound his own voice had made in a hospital billing office 18 months earlier, asking a very similar question about a number that had ruined his life. He watched her uncap the pen. I know how, Ellis thought, his knuckles white against the plastic rim of the recycling bin. I know exactly how. Before the part of his brain that calculated risk could finish calculating it, his mouth was already moving. Wait. The word landed in the boardroom like a dropped glass. Nolan Pierce spun first, adjusting his readers as though trying to bring an unfamiliar species into focus. Malcolm Ferris went very still, the particular stillness of a man recalculating something quickly. Charlotte's pen stopped a hair's breadth above the signature line, and she turned slowly, her sharp gray eyes finding the man in the gray uniform stepping out of the shadow by the bins. He felt absurd. Steel-toed boots, a stain of industrial-strength glass cleaner down one sleeve, a half-full garbage bag still in his fist. "Excuse me?" Pierce's voice cracked like a whip across the room. "Who let the janitorial staff in here?" "Security." "Don't sign it," Ellis said. His voice shook on the first two words, and then, strangely, steadied, the way it used to steady when he presented a model to a room full of actuaries twice his seniority. "Not until somebody explains how you executed $60 million of currency hedges through Kestrel Bridge Capital on October the 12th, when the TSX clearing system was down for 6 hours that day. Nobody traded anything that day. I was listening to it happen on the radio." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It had teeth. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Malcolm said too quickly, and reached for the tablet controlling the glass display, as though he might simply switch the numbers off and make the man disappear along with them. "This is proprietary information. You have no business. Leave the screen on, Malcolm." Charlotte had not raised her voice, but something in it made the CFO's hand stop halfway to the tablet. She was looking at Ellis now with an expression Ellis couldn't quite read. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to the look of a person hearing, for the first time in 8 months, a piece of information that actually made sense of the pain she'd been living inside. "What's your name?" "Ellis. Ellis Novak, Mr. Novak." She set the pen down, not capped, just down, flat on the papers, the small motion of a woman buying herself 30 more seconds of a company that still technically existed. "Say that again." Slowly. He did. He walked her through it the way he used to walk clients through actuarial exhibits. Trade dates lined up against the exchange outage, the mismatch between the counterparty's registered clearing bank and every other legitimate trade on the ledger, the mailbox address in Georgetown. It took him 4 minutes. William Bradley opened his mouth twice to object and closed it twice, because the numbers, once you saw them lined up, were not actually complicated. They were, in fact, embarrassingly simple, which was exactly the kind of fraud that survives longest inside an organization too dazzled by its own complexity to check the small things. "That's absurd," Malcolm said, and for the first time his practiced warmth had a hairline crack in it. "The man cleans toilets. He doesn't know what he's looking at. I have a bachelor's in actuarial science from the University of Waterloo and 11 years pricing derivatives at Confederation Mutual before I was laid off caring for my son," Ellis said, quietly enough that it landed harder than shouting would have. "I know exactly what I'm looking at." Charlotte Renfrew looked at her CFO of 26 years for a long moment. Then she picked the insolvency filing up off the table, walked it to the shredder in the corner, the same shredder Ellis had emptied twice that week, and fed all 300 pages through it, one stack at a time, while the room watched in silence broken only by the mechanical grinding of the blades. "Nolan," she said, when the last page had disappeared, "get me a forensic accounting team. Not our internal audit. They've had 4 months to find this and didn't. Someone independent. I want them in this building by 9 a.m. and somebody get Mr. Novak a coffee and a chair. He's not going anywhere." What followed was not a single dramatic unmasking, so much as a slow, careful unraveling, the kind that takes patient people days rather than minutes. Charlotte brought in a forensic team from a firm on King Street that specialized in pension fraud, and she brought Ellis in beside them over Malcolm Ferris's furious objections, because, as she told the board in a private call that afternoon, the man just found in 4 minutes what our internal controls missed for 4 months. I'd be a fool not to use him. They found that Kestrel Bridge Capital had been incorporated 18 months earlier, its sole listed director, a paralegal, in Malcolm Ferris's brother-in-law's firm. They found that the wire transfers routing through Georgetown eventually resurfaced, laundered through 2 more shell entities, in a numbered account in Geneva that had, over 14 months, received just under $420 million. money that had, on paper, simply lost itself to bad currency bets that had never actually been placed. They found, buried in an email server backup nobody had thought to check because it predated the current compliance system, a message from Malcolm to a private banker in Zurich, sent 9 months earlier, that read only, "Second tranche cleared. As discussed, keep this off the quarterly reconciliations until year-end." Ellis found that one. He'd spent 3 straight nights in a windowless conference room with the forensic team, Milo's medication chart taped beside his laptop as a reminder to leave by 11, cross-referencing wire timestamps against trading system logs with the same dogged, unglamorous patience he used to bring to actuarial tables. When he found the email, he didn't shout. He just turned his laptop around and slid it across the table to Charlotte and watched her face go from exhausted to something colder and more focused than exhaustion. The face of a woman who had just stopped grieving her company and started fighting for it. Malcolm Ferris was confronted on a Thursday, in the same boardroom, with the Ontario Securities Commission's Enforcement Branch and 2 RCMP financial crimes investigators present. He denied everything for 11 minutes, then asked for a lawyer, then said nothing further. His accounts, along with Kestrel Bridge Capital's, were frozen within 48 hours under a Moreva injunction Nolan Pierce's firm filed at speed neither Ellis nor Charlotte had thought possible. Just under $390 million was recovered and repatriated over the following 6 weeks. Not all of it, but enough, combined with the credit lines RBC and Scotiabank, restored the moment the fraud came to light and the insolvency filing evaporated, to make Northfield Capital Partners solvent again for the first time in 5 months. There was a smaller, quieter discovery too, one that never made the Financial Post headline but that Charlotte carried differently than the rest. Malcolm had not acted entirely alone. A rival wealth manager, Larkin Cole Advisory, had spent the past year quietly courting Northfield's largest institutional clients, timing their pitch meetings suspiciously close to Malcolm's fabricated bad news. It didn't prove collusion, not legally, but it told Charlotte something about who had been circling the wreckage before it was even wreckage. And she filed that knowledge away with the cold patience of a woman who intended to do something about it later. 6 weeks after the shredder ate the insolvency filing, Charlotte Renfrew convened the board of Northfield Capital Partners around the same mahogany table where, not so long before, they had watched her prepare to sign the company out of existence. They looked at her now the way people look at a storm that has passed directly overhead and somehow left them standing. "The deficit is resolved," she told them, and the words came out with the flat, unshakable authority of someone who had earned the right to say them plainly. "Our credit facilities are fully restored. The pension trustees have been made whole, with interest, ahead of schedule. And as of this morning, Larkin Cole Advisory has withdrawn its outstanding offers to 3 of our largest clients, because those clients have seen exactly what happens to a firm that gets caught circling a competitor mid-crisis. A ripple of something, not quite laughter, but close, moved around the table. We are not just solvent. We are stronger than we were before any of this happened." The board applauded, and she let them for a moment before she raised a hand. "One more thing." She turned toward the back of the room, where Ellis Novak stood in a suit that fit him properly for the first time in 5 years. Not borrowed, not a hand-me-down from his brother-in-law's closet, but tailored, at Charlotte's insistence, by a man on Yonge Street who did that sort of thing for people whose careers were about to change shape. Ellis walked forward, spine straight, and Charlotte watched 22 members of her board, several of whom, 6 weeks earlier, had looked at this man like he was a trespasser to be removed by force, sit up a little straighter. "I'd like to introduce Ellis Novak, Northfield's new Chief Risk Officer," Charlotte said. "He found in 4 minutes what our compliance department missed in 4 months, and if he tells this board a number is wrong, I expect every person in this room to listen the first time, not the third." They rose, one by one, and shook his hand, the same hands that, weeks earlier, had reached for security instead. Ellis smiled politely and shook each one, but his mind was already somewhere else, 300 kilometers away and 9 days in the future, at a hospital on University Avenue. The morning of Milo's surgery, snow was still falling over Toronto, softer now, the kind that gathers quietly on windowsills instead of lashing sideways. Ellis sat in the family waiting area at the hospital for sick children, with a cardboard cup of Tim Hortons coffee cooling untouched in his hands. And he did not look up when the elevator doors opened, because he already knew, from the particular rhythm of the footsteps, who it was. Charlotte sat down beside him without asking, the way people do who have stopped being strangers, and said a second coffee. His usual double-double. She'd learned it after the third late night in the conference room, on the little table between them. "You didn't have to come," Ellis said. "I know." She looked at the closed double doors down the hall, the ones with the small illuminated sign that read, "Surgery in progress." "You saved my life's work, Ellis. Sitting in a waiting room is the least I can do while someone else saves yours." They didn't talk much after that. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said in 6 weeks of shell companies and shredders and frozen Swiss accounts. Ellis thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the worst year of his life and the best had turned out to be the same year, folded together so tightly he couldn't find the seam between them anymore. 4 hours and 12 minutes later, a surgeon in blue scrubs pushed through the double doors with the particular unhurried calm that meant good news, and told Ellis that the repair had gone exactly as planned, that Milo's heart, small and stubborn, had held together beautifully. 3 weeks after that, in a sunlit playroom on the recovery floor, Ellis sat in a vinyl armchair, holding a cup of considerably better coffee than hospital vending machines usually produced, and watched his son chase a nurse down the hallway in a hospital gown covered in cartoon hockey players, laughing so hard he had to stop and catch his breath against the wall. Milo was thinner than he should have been, and a thin pink scar ran down the center of his chest that he would carry for the rest of his life, but his cheeks had color in them again, and his laugh filled the whole corridor. Charlotte sat beside Ellis, dressed down for once in a cable-knit sweater instead of a tailored suit, holding a helium balloon shaped like a maple leaf that Milo had picked out himself. "He's got some energy on him," she said, smiling in a way Ellis hadn't seen from her in the boardroom ever. "He's a fighter," Ellis said, and his voice caught slightly on the word, the way it always did now when he talked about his son. He looked over at the woman beside him, the CEO who had become, somewhere in the middle of forensic ledgers and frozen offshore accounts, something closer to family than colleague. "Thank you. For all of it. You don't owe me anything, Ellis." Charlotte kept her eyes on the boy running circles around the nurse's station, her voice quiet enough that it was really only meant for him. "You saved the company 40,000 people's pensions depend on. I just made sure you got to keep the one thing that actually mattered to you." Ellis looked down at the watch Charlotte had given him the week he took the chief risk officer title, a small, understated thing, nothing flashy. Exactly the kind of gift a person gives someone they've come to genuinely respect rather than someone they're trying to impress. He didn't have to mop a boardroom floor tonight. He didn't have to dodge a supervisor threatening to dock his pay, or lie awake doing arithmetic on hospital bills he couldn't cover. He just had to take his son home, read him a story about a hockey-playing dinosaur that Milo had loved since before the diagnosis, and wake up tomorrow to help run one of the largest wealth management firms in the country. Some winters take everything from a person and leave nothing behind but debt and grief and a mop bucket on wheels. And some winters, if you're patient enough and honest enough and lucky enough to be standing in the right corner of the right room at the right moment, hand everything back with interest.